When I first moved into that quiet suburban neighborhood, I thought I'd found peace. It was a beautiful area lined with oak trees, clean sidewalks, and homes that looked like they came straight out of a magazine. It felt like a perfect place to start over. I had just left city life behind and was ready for something slower, more peaceful. The only problem was the homeowners association, which, at first, seemed harmless enough. They sent out their newsletters, organized community events, and maintained the park near the lake. But it didn't take long before I realized that beneath the polite smiles and neatly trimmed lawns, there was a rigid control system ruled by one woman, Karen. She was the HOA president, and her word was practically law in that neighborhood. The first time I met her, she stood on my driveway holding a clipboard and a forced smile. She welcomed me, congratulated me on my lovely new home, and then, within the same breath, told me my exterior paint color didn't quite align with the community guidelines. I had painted my home a soft slate gray, nothing outrageous or flashy, but apparently, it wasn't part of the approved palette. I laughed it off, thinking it was a minor issue that would go away. I didn't know then that it was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving letters, first friendly reminders, then formal warnings from the HOA. Karen claimed my lawn was uneven, my mailbox not compliant, and my porch light too bright. Each complaint was signed with her name in perfect cursive. I began to notice her car driving slowly past my house almost every evening. It was unsettling, but I tried to stay calm. After all, I was a judge retired, technically, but still licensed. I'd dealt with people like her before, the kind who thrive on control, who find power in policing others. I told myself not to engage, to keep my composure. But Karen didn't stop. One morning, I woke up to find an official HOA notice taped to my door. It demanded that I repaint my house within 30 days to one of their approved shades, or face escalating fines. I stood on my porch reading it in disbelief. My home wasn't an eyesore, it blended in perfectly with the rest of the neighborhood. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address it directly. That's when I truly saw what I was dealing with. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, and about 20 residents sat around folding tables. Karen stood at the front like a queen addressing her subjects. The moment I brought up the absurdity of the paint rule, she smiled in that passive-aggressive way and said, "We just want to maintain property values, dear. You understand?" Her tone was syrupy but condescending, and I could tell no one dared oppose her. I noticed the way people avoided eye contact when I spoke, afraid of being on her bad side. I walked out of that meeting frustrated but determined not to bend. I wasn't about to let a self-appointed dictator tell me what I could or couldn't do with my property. The next week, I sent her a formal letter citing state housing law and the limits of HOA authority. I reminded her that my house met all county codes and that color restrictions, unless explicitly approved by all homeowners, were unenforceable. It was polite but firm, something I'd written hundreds of times in my legal career. 2 days later, she showed up at my door. "You don't want to make this hard on yourself," she said, her voice low and cold. "The HOA can make life very uncomfortable." I remember looking her straight in the eye and replying, "Karen, you don't scare me. You're overstepping your authority." She glared at me for a moment before turning and walking away without another word. After that, things got worse. My trash cans were mysteriously knocked over every week. Someone poured sugar into my mailbox. I caught her taking photos of my home one evening, pretending to be on a walk. I called the HOA board to complain, but they brushed it off. It was clear Karen had them all wrapped around her finger. a few neighbors started avoiding me altogether. It was clear that Karen had been whispering things telling people I was difficult, or non-compliant. It reminded me of courtroom bullies who try to win through intimidation. But I stayed calm. I documented everything, photos, dates, letters, even the small acts of harassment. I didn't realize then that I would soon need every piece of that evidence. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when I was washing my car. Karen walked by with her dog and stopped just a few feet away, pretending to tie her shoe. Then she looked up and said, "You really should just sell this place. It's not the right fit for this neighborhood." I couldn't help but laugh a little. "You mean it's not the right fit for you?" I replied. Her expression hardened. "People talk, you know. Nobody wants to live next to someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them." That's when I saw it in her eyes, pure hatred. This wasn't just about a paint color or a rule. It was personal. She didn't like that she couldn't control me. She saw my independence as defiance. I could feel something dark brewing behind that fake smile. Over the next few weeks, small things began to happen. My garden hose was cut. My car tires were slashed once. I even found dead plants by my mailbox where someone had poured salt into the soil. I reported it to the police, but there was no direct evidence. I knew who it was, but she was careful, too careful. I kept telling myself it couldn't go further than this. It was all petty harassment, and people like her eventually get bored. But I was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of crackling. I looked out my window and saw orange light flickering across my driveway. My front porch was on fire. My heart raced as I grabbed the extinguisher and called 911. By the time the firefighters arrived, the flames had spread too far. I stood outside in disbelief as they fought the blaze. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering. And there she was, Karen, standing at the edge of her property, pretending to look concerned. The next morning, the fire chief told me it looked deliberate. The accelerant used was gasoline. My stomach dropped. I knew. I didn't have proof yet, but I knew who had done it. And that's when something inside me changed. I wasn't just the victim anymore. I was going to make sure she faced the consequences, no matter how long it took. Little did Karen know, the man she'd been tormenting wasn't just another homeowner. I was someone who'd spent decades watching justice unfold, and soon enough, she was going to learn exactly what that meant. The night my house burned was the kind of night that makes ordinary memory feel unreal. Clear sky, a faint breeze, the sort of quiet that usually comforts you. I'd gone to bed early after a long day of meetings and paperwork, leaving the porch light on because the electricity had been cutting in and out all week. Sometime around 2 in the morning the smoke alarm woke me. At first it sounded distant, like a bad dream. Then the smell hit me, acrid and sharp, and I knew before I stumbled downstairs that something was terribly wrong. The living room windows were already glowing orange when I peeled back the curtain, and the front of the house was an inferno in miniature, flames licking the eaves, sending sparks like a rain of tiny stars into the night. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone and called 911, then the neighbors' porches blurred into motion and a parade of flashlights bobbed toward the street. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the flames had taken hold of the roof. The firefighters worked like a choreography I'd only ever watched in courtroom videos, calm professionals following practiced steps against chaos. I stood on the sidewalk under a blanket that someone threw over my shoulders and watched men and women risk everything to save what could be saved. In those moments, all the petty fights, the HOA notices, the late-night photographs, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the hiss of the hose and the urgency on the faces of people doing the work. When the firefighters finally announced the fire was contained, the house looked like a husk, blackened rafters, melted gutters, and the remnants of a life scattered and charred inside. The smell of smoke stayed with me for days, like an unwelcome shadow. The next morning brought questions and a detective with a notepad. I answered the usual: when did I go to bed, did I leave anything running, any recent wiring work. They checked the fuse box, peered at the scorched wiring, and talked in those clipped tones that mean someone suspects foul play. The fire chief pulled me aside and said bluntly that the point of origin suggested accelerant. That word landed in my chest like a stone. Arson. People imagine arson as something dramatic in films, but in life it's methodical and cruel, the deliberate destruction of another person's world. I kept my voice steady when I told the detective I suspected who might be responsible. I had documented months of harassment, tampering with the mailbox, slashed tires, late-night surveillance. I'd saved the HOA notices, the emails, and the photographs. But suspicion and proof are different things. The investigators would need evidence. As the days unfolded, the neighborhood divided into factions the way a courtroom audience divides when a verdict is read. Some stood with me quietly, bringing blankets and casseroles, a few crossed the street to offer terse condolences and careful silence, and then there were those who kept their distance, eyes darting away when we made eye contact. Gossip is a corrosive thing, and small towns, even the cul-de-sac kind, run on it. The HOA circulated a statement expressing shock and sympathy and promising full cooperation with the investigation. Karen chaired a meeting on my front lawn with a practiced look of sorrow that never quite reached her eyes. I listened to her speak, felt the words like stones thrown at a glass house: we must support one another in this difficult time. It was all very performative. Inside, I catalogued everything in my head: the meetings, the threats, the times she had been photographed near my property after dark. The pieces were there, but I couldn't act on them without the investigators. The county arson unit took over, and their work felt like a slow, careful evisceration of the scene. They removed charred beams, scraped away soot, took swabs and samples of suspicious residues. I sat in an empty folding chair while they worked, the sting of being a specimen in my own life waxing and waning. Someone from the environmental team bagged up fragments of incendiary devices. A detective explained how a small amount of accelerant could be distributed in a way to ensure flashover. Their language was clinical, but what they described translated to a human cost: photographs lost, family heirlooms turned to ash, years of accumulated evidence gone. The insurance representative came through with a sympathetic clipboard and a list of things that would be covered and a list of many more things that required proof. In the course of my life as a jurist, I'd seen the slow machinery of law grind in measured ways. Now I was subject to its gears in a very personal fashion. It didn't take long for the rumor mill to latch on to candidates for blame. Karen, with her earlier threats and the visible tension with me, was an obvious target. Some of my neighbors, including a few who privately confided their own frustrations about her, came forward with statements about her previous overreaching behavior. One neighbor produced photographs he'd taken of Karen near my property on nights she'd claimed she was elsewhere. His timing aligned with other suspicious activity. But the arson unit's lead investigator reminded me repeatedly that motive is not proof. They needed a smoking gun, something that tied the accelerant or the device to a specific person. It was maddening to watch detectives treat my mounting pile of circumstantial evidence with polite skepticism, but I understood the caution. We live by standards of proof for a reason. In the days that followed, I did what I knew best: I organized the facts. I drew timelines, cross-referenced dates of HOA letters with incidents, and compiled the security footage from a neighbor's camera that had captured a shadowy vehicle idling near my driveway the night before the fire. The footage was grainy, anonymous, but sometimes anonymity can be pierced with patient work. A license plate partial, a unique hubcap, a timestamp, small things that, when combined, become a rope. I shared everything with the detectives, who listened and took the documents with the professional gravity I'd come to recognize in court. They asked me to stay available, to not speak publicly about theories, and to let them do their work. It was as if I had litigated this case for a lifetime and now had to place the burden of proof in others' hands. The emotional toll was heavier than the paperwork. Sleeping felt like a dare. The house had been a sanctuary and now it was a site visited by strangers in safety boots. I missed the creak of the stairs, the particular way evening light hit the bookcase where old case files and family albums lived. Memory kept playing back the image of flames reflected in the window, and sometimes I would pause and forget for a few seconds which room I was in and then remember what was gone. Friends tried to buoy me with conversation and food. Some neighbors quietly offered to store the boxes of case records that were salvageable. The local clergy came by with offers of counsel not because I'd asked but because in small communities people notice when something cataclysmic happens. One afternoon, 2 detectives arrived with news that made the hair on my neck stand up. They had found trace residues on a fragment consistent with the kind of accelerant used by a certain brand of sprayer kept in maintenance sheds and landscaping supplies. They couldn't say more, not yet, but they wanted to know who had access to those supplies. My mind went to the HOA maintenance crew and to the small cache of equipment the board kept in a locked shed. I reached for my phone, trying to keep my hands from trembling, and sent the detectives copies of the inventory logs and the names of those with keys. It was a legal moment made personal, putting documents in the hands of investigators and waiting to see if bureaucracy would translate into accountability. When the first subpoena arrived for HOA records and for the maintenance shed's logbook, the neighborhood's hum shifted. The board scrambled, held an emergency meeting, and the polite statements of condolence stiffened. Karen, who had been all solidarity and solemn gestures for a week, gave terse answers and avoided cameras. The press began to sniff. A local reporter called asking for comments. I declined to speak beyond the official channels. This was no time for headlines. I trusted the process, even as the process moved at its own stately pace. There were legal motions, the possibility of search warrants, and discussions about counsel that made the grown ups in the neighborhood speak in whispers. I wouldn't pretend I wasn't tempted to take action in my own hands. The urge to confront, to produce the paperwork with a smile and a courtroom's blunt efficiency, was nearly irresistible. But my years on the bench taught me restraint, how to let evidence lead, how to avoid the traps of assumption. So I documented, submitted, and waited. And while I waited, I watched Karen's posture change. The tilt of the head that used to say I'm in control softened into something like calculation. People who had once deferred to her began to ask questions openly at the grocery store and at weekend barbecues. Her circle tightened. The board muttered about counsel and crisis management. It was a slow unraveling, not spectacular, but real. As the investigation deepened and the state's arson experts continued their analysis, control finally started to shift from rumor to process. I found it strange and oddly satisfying that the same mechanisms I'd overseen as a judge, the thorough collection of proof, the dry but relentless logic of investigation, were now the instruments that might bring the truth into light. I still mourned the house, the artifacts, the late-night quiet that had once been my companion. But I no longer felt alone. The law, which I'd spent a lifetime both serving and interpreting, was engaged now not as concept but as action. And somewhere in the shuffle of reports and subpoenas, the idea that those who would destroy could be held to account began to feel less like a hope and more like an approaching certainty. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of sterile scent that always reminded me of long trials and heavy verdicts. It had been months since the night my home went up in flames, months of investigation, paperwork, and silence that often felt heavier than the fire itself. The arson unit had finally connected the dots: the accelerant used, the access logs from the HOA maintenance shed, the surveillance footage of a car matching Karen's pulling up to my property that night. When they told me she'd been arrested, I felt no joy, no victory, just a strange sense of inevitability. People like Karen always believed they were untouchable until the evidence became undeniable. What she didn't know, and what would turn this entire story on its head, was that fate had arranged a meeting she could never have imagined. The trial had been scheduled in the county courthouse where I had once presided for more than a decade. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me. I had retired 2 years prior, but I was still occasionally called in for special assignments. And as luck would have it, on the morning Karen arrived for her preliminary hearing, I was the assigned judge. The moment she walked through those doors, her expression went from smug defiance to utter disbelief. I saw it in her eyes before she even recognized my face. She froze mid-step as the bailiff called the court to order, her gaze flicking from the bench to the papers in her trembling hands. She had come expecting another powerless bureaucrat to charm or intimidate. Instead, she found me sitting behind the bench in full judicial robes, calm and unreadable, watching her with the kind of detached focus I had used on countless defendants before her. I said nothing for the first few moments, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the situation to sink in. The courtroom was filled with that tense energy that always accompanies cases born from community scandal. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised, cameras waiting outside. Neighbors she once lorded over sat quietly, unsure whether to pity or despise her. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering into her ear, but Karen couldn't tear her eyes away from me. Case number 4817 State vs. Karen Hughes, the clerk read aloud. Charges: arson, property destruction, and endangerment. I kept my tone steady, purely procedural, as I acknowledged the record. Ms. Hughes, you stand accused of multiple felonies, I began, my voice echoing softly in the high-ceilinged room. You have the right to remain silent and to legal representation. I trust you've already secured counsel. She nodded stiffly, barely breathing. I didn't allow even a flicker of emotion to break through. In that moment, I wasn't her victim, and she wasn't my tormentor. She was just another defendant before the law, something she had never expected to be. Her attorney spoke first, trying to downplay the situation. Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence and believes she is the victim of circumstantial evidence. The alleged materials found in the HOA shed are accessible to multiple individuals. His voice wavered slightly under the weight of the room. I listened patiently, taking notes, never once looking up until he was done. Then I leaned forward just slightly. Mr. Powell, I said, you'll have ample time to argue your defense when the trial begins. For now, we are here to establish probable cause, and I see substantial evidence to proceed. Karen's face paled. Her hands clenched the table in front of her as if gripping it would keep her grounded. It was strange, watching her in this role reversal. This woman who once strutted through the neighborhood with a clipboard and a smile that dripped with superiority now sat silent in the very room where I had once signed rulings that determined people's futures. The irony was almost poetic. The prosecution laid out their summary: the accelerant residue matched samples from her shed, surveillance footage confirmed her car's presence, and a witness, a maintenance worker, testified that Karen had ordered him to leave the premises early the night of the fire. Each piece fell into place like clockwork, methodical and irrefutable. Every word was a nail in the coffin of her arrogance. When the hearing paused for recess, I watched her lawyer lean in close, whispering urgently, but Karen didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the desk, her breathing shallow. I stepped out into the corridor, removing my robe and allowing myself a single deep breath. The hallway buzzed with quiet chatter from reporters. I ignored them. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about closure. I thought of the night of the fire, the smell of smoke in my lungs, the faces of firefighters reflecting orange light. I thought of how helpless I felt watching everything I owned collapse into ash. Now, for the first time since that night, I felt the world tilt back toward balance. When we reconvened, I called the court to order. "Ms. Hughes," I said, "you will be remanded pending trial. The evidence presented today establishes probable cause." Her lawyer started to protest, but she cut him off with a sudden burst of anger. "You can't do this to me," she shouted, standing abruptly. "This is personal. You're doing this because of that stupid house." The bailiff stepped forward immediately, but I raised a hand. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice calm and cold. "You burned a home to the ground, Ms. Hughes. You endangered lives. This court deals in facts, not feelings." Her defiance faltered, the words seemed to sink into her like stones. For a brief moment, the courtroom was completely silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioner. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling. Her arrogance had melted away, replaced by something almost unrecognizable: fear. The bailiff escorted her out after the ruling, and as the heavy wooden doors closed behind her, I felt a quiet finality settle over the room. There was no satisfaction in watching her go, only a deep sense of justice finally restored. In the days that followed, her story spread like wildfire. The HOA she once ruled disbanded within weeks, facing lawsuits from multiple residents. Investigations uncovered years of financial mismanagement, petty harassment, and misuse of funds under her leadership. The neighborhood, once strangled by her control, began to breathe again. As for me, I rebuilt literally and figuratively. The insurance settlement came through, and with the help of a few good neighbors who had stood by me through everything, I started constructing a new home on the same lot. Every board, every nail, every stroke of paint felt like reclaiming something she had tried to destroy. When the new house was finally finished, I stood on the porch one evening as the sun set behind the trees, casting long golden reflections across the freshly painted walls. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about peace. The law had done what it was meant to do. Justice had spoken, not through anger or emotion, but through truth. And as I watched the light fade, I couldn't help but think about how life has a way of turning full circle. Karen had wanted power, control, and recognition, but in the end, she met all three in the worst possible place inside a courtroom, stripped of everything she thought made her untouchable. And as for me, I had learned that sometimes the universe doesn't need you to fight back with fury. Sometimes, it simply waits for the right moment to let justice walk in wearing your own face.